It's hard enough to get one single tenon to fit one mortise perfectly, but it gets about 4 times harder when you have a double tenon and a double mortise. In his video series on building an Asian-inspired hall table, Tim Rousseau gives us the secret. It's spacer blocks. It's so simple that you'll probably wonder why you didn't think of it before. Let's watch.
So this is the setup that I'm using to cut the double mortises in the aprons. I've got a plunge router and a fence that goes with it. I also happen to have a second fence, and that just allows me to not come off the work, just some insurance. The trick here is I've made this shim, and the way this shim works is I'm going to insert it after I make the first cut, and it's going to move the router the amount I need to get over to the second mortise. This shim width is exactly the distance between those two pencil lines that I just made. To start the setup, I position the router over the first mortise I want to cut. Plunge the bit down close to the surface, and I'm going to adjust the guide fence until I feel the spacing is good. To double check that this is where I want it to be, I'll put a little pressure on the router, spin the bit backwards, and have a look at it in relationship to my line. And that looks good, so now I can set the remaining 2 end stops. So for this, I swing the cutter 90 degrees, bring it over to one of the pencil lines. I don't want to remove the pencil line, just get close to it. I'm going to double stick tape a little block on this side, move the router, and place my second block. And that just keeps me from getting out of line there. This other apron I have here just for support, so the router is not tippy. This is the point where I can slide on the second fence. I'll set the depth, and then I'm ready to route. I plunge the 2 ends first, and then with that done, I'll go and take shallow cuts about an 1/8 inch deep until I hit the bottom stop. With the top mortise now routed, I can pop off the extra fence, insert the spacer block, route the next, and it's going to be the same thing all the way down the line for the remainder. With all of the mortises routed, now's the time to define their ends with a knife. I'm going to do that the same way I did with the pencil and the ruler. When I'm knifing the 2 ends, my square is going to cover the mortise, so I can't see where to start and stop. I'm just going to place a couple of little pencil marks on either side so I can see where to start and stop knifing. I'll cover the mortise with my square and then place the ruler back on the part. Okay, so there's knife lines, and then I would do the other side. Now that these are all knifed out, I can grab my mortise chisel, chisel halfway in from each side, and our through mortises are done. And just like before, I drop the body of the mortise chisel into the mortise to guide it in, stand it up in the knife line, and then halfway in. Okay. And I'll flip it, work through from this side. And what happens on this side is when you get to the halfway point, the chisel will pop a little bit, so I'm just waiting for the pop. Pop. Well, I finally got all those mortises chiseled out, so now I can get on to my favorite part, and that is cutting the double tenons. What I like so much about this is that I'm going to get one line to set on my under rails, and then with the 2 spacers I can just follow along with the bouncing ball and the tenons just show up. The spacer I have used first that you've seen already is the one that shifts for the mortises, going from one mortise to the next. The other spacer that you haven't seen yet is the one that generates the tenon. And so I'm going to be making a 5/16 tenon. The way to make this spacer is to just simply measure the size of your mortise, figure out what the kerf is from the bandsaw, and then just add that to the mortise size. So this is slightly bigger than my mortise by the kerf of the bandsaw. So with these two now, I can start to lay out my shoulders, get my first mark, and go for it. I begin by scribing a line that defines the shoulders on my 3 rails. To keep track of their orientation on the table, I'll place a cabinet maker's triangle on their tops. The last thing I do before heading to the bandsaw is to mark the location of my first cut. Now at the bandsaw, I can line up on my mark and make my first cut on either end. Next, I insert the tenon spacer and repeat the process. Here's my first tenon. The larger mortise spacer is used for the third cut. And the final cut combines both spacers at once. I like to cut away what waste I can on the bandsaw before heading back to the bench. Now, using a fret saw, I can remove the majority of the waste from between the 2 tenons and follow up with a bit of light chisel work. It's the same process for all 3 under rails.
My favorite part about Tim's technique is that he uses the same spacer blocks for both the mortises and the tenons. To watch Tim build the table from start to finish, become a member of finewoodworking.com. You'll get access to the entire series, plus our whole lineup of other video workshops.